The Police from Irish Wonders. The Police. Public domain reading. During the last few years, the most obviously conspicuous individual in Ireland is the policeman. Go where you will, if the policeman is not there before you, the reason is probably to be found in the fact that he has just been there, and will likely return before you leave. In Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Athlone, Belfast, and other large cities and towns, the police are seen at every corner, singly, in pairs, and in groups. Fresh-looking police are going on duty. Tired-out police are going home. Clean, well-brushed police are starting to the country on horseback, having heard reports of rural disturbances. Muddy police are coming in on jaunting cars, with prisoners from the nearest eviction. Everywhere you meet them, young policemen with fresh, rosy complexions. Middle-aged policemen with stern faces, bearing strong evidence of Irish pugilistic talent. Old policemen with deeply scarred and weather-beaten countenances, looking forward to a speedy retirement and a moderate pension. They are in the city, in the village, on the high road, in the byway, and on the mountain paths. At every railroad station they are to be seen in pairs, observing those who arrive and depart, and noting all that may seem suspicious in the appearance and actions of travelers. As long as a stranger remains on the common, well-frequented tourist routes, he escapes with a sharp glance of inspection, but let him leave the courses usually followed by travelers, or go into parts of the country not often visited by strangers, and he at once becomes an object of intense suspicion. You are driving along a retired country road. At the turn of a hill, a policeman heaves in sight. He speaks pleasantly, and if nothing arouses his suspicion, he will pass on, and you see him no more. But if the slightest distrust of you or your business finds lodgment in his mind, he marks you as a possible victim. He temporarily vanishes. Look round as you proceed on your journey, and you may, by chance, catch a glimpse of him a mile or two away, peeping over a wall after you. In the next village, where you stop for the night, he reappears, and the local policeman after his coming will be sure to observe you with some degree of attention. Leave your baggage in the public room of the inn, and step out onto the street. In comes the policeman, ascertains your name, takes a mental inventory of your effects, makes a note of the railway and hotel labels on your trunks, and goes away to report. A sharp detective is the policeman, even in the country districts. He knows articles of American manufacture at a glance, and needs only to see your satchel to tell whether it came from America or whether it was made in England. Talk with him, and he will chat cordially about the weather, the crops, the state of the markets, but all the time he is trying to make out who you are and what is your business. His eyes ramble from your hat to your shoes, and by the time the conversation is ended, he has prepared for the sergeant a report of your personal appearance and apparel. Hat, English. Coat, London made. Trousers, doubtful. Shoes, American. Party, evidently an Irish Yankee, who might as well be looked after. The Irish policeman, or constable, as he is familiarly known on his native sod, is the son of a peasant. Finding life as a labourer or tenant in either case intolerable, he debated in his own mind the question whether he should emigrate to America, enlist in the British Army, or apply for a place on the constabulary. The first step was to him the most acceptable, but he lacked the money to go to America. Of the two courses left open, enlistment in the army was the more pleasant, since in Ireland the constabulary are almost entirely cut off from association with the people in the social or friendly way. A general belief prevailing that the Irishman who enters the police has deserted the cause of his country and entered the service of her deadliest foe. So the police are avoided by their former companions. They are shunned by their old friends. And lastly, what is of some consequence to a genuine Irishman are given the cold shoulder by the ladies. To be sure, the Irishman who enlists in the British Army would be treated in the same way at his old home. But as he usually leaves never to return, the case is materially different. Chances, or the obligation of supporting aged parents, or a helpless family of young brothers and sisters, usually determines the question, and the young Irishman enters the constabulary, thenceforth to be a social leper, for the constable is hated by his countrymen with a hatred that knows no bound. From the day he puts on his neat blue uniform and saucer-like cap, the constable in the troubled West Coast counties carries his life in his hand. Every hedge he scrutinizes with a careful eye. Behind it may lurk an assassin. Every division wall is watched for suspicious indications, his alertness being quickened by the knowledge that he is guarding his own life. He is compelled to undertake duties obnoxious to his own feelings and sense of justice, and to risk life and limb to carry out repugnant orders. A bad year comes, a tenant is in arrears and cannot pay rent. The agent determines on an eviction and sends for the police. The constables arrive in force, but the tenant has anticipated them and collected a crowd of friends. The hut is closed and barred, while inside are half a score of men and women, determined to resist as long as resistance is of any avail. As soon as the police appear on the scene, a babel of Irish voices ensues, and fearful curses and imprecations are hurled at all concerned in the eviction, succeeded by showers of stones from enthusiastic outside supporters of the cabin defenders. The constables draw their clubs and make a rush, striking right and left at the heads of the crowd. A desperate battle ensues, in which the police are generally victorious, driving the rabble to a safe distance. Then, leaving a portion of the force to keep them away, the remainder return to effect an entrance to the hut. A beam handled by several pairs of strong arms speedily demolishes the miserable pretense of a door. Then in go the police, to be met with fists, clubs, stones, showers of boiling water, and other effective and offensive means of defense. After a stubborn contest, the cabin is finally cleared. The furniture, if there be any, is set out in the road. The thatched roof torn off and scattered on the ground. The walls leveled, and the police battered with sticks and stones, scalded, burned, return to headquarters with their prisoners. Not infrequently, a policeman is killed on one of these evictionary expeditions. the defence of his slayers being generally grounded on the statement made in court in one instance of this kind near Limerick. We never intended for to kill him at all, but his skull was too thin entirely for a constable, and broke with the baton he was after getting. Firearms are not often used in these encounters between the police and the populace, for such battles always take place in daylight, and although, when an eviction promises to be of more than usual danger, the police carry rifles, strict orders are given not to use them save in dire extremity, and a policeman will be beaten almost to death without resorting to the use of a gun. On ordinary day-to-day police duty, police carry only a short club or revolver hidden under the coat. But at night, the country constables are armed with rifle and bayonet, and patrol the roads in pairs, one walking on each side and as close as possible to the hedge or wall. But in spite of the extraordinary difficulties and unceasing dangers of his work, the constable does his duty with scrupulous exactness, and instances of treachery to the government among the Irish constabulary are extremely rare. Indeed, service in the constabulary is much sought for, and there are always more applicants than vacancies. The physical standard is so high that the police are the picked men of the country, while the average grade of intelligence among them is better than among the peasantry from whose ranks they have come. Ready as they are to go cheerfully on any service, however laborious or perilous, there is one task which the constabulary of the West Coast hold in moral detestation, and that is an expedition into the mountains to seize illicit stills and to arrest distillers of poteen. Such an enterprise means days and nights of toilsome climbing, watching, waiting, and spying, often without any results, and generally with a strong probability that when the spot where the still has been is surrounded, the police thinking that they have the lawbreakers in a trap, the latter take the alarm, escape by some hidden, unknown path, leaving nothing but the pot and the smell as reminiscences of their presence and employment. The disappointing nature of the duty is thus one good reason for the dislike felt for it by the constables. But another is found in the unusual degree of peril attending it, for in the mountains of Donegal, Mayo, and so much discomfort to the constables that the latter frequently give up the chase on a very slight provocation. Near Lake Derryclare, in the Connemara district of Galway, and almost always under the shadow of the 12 Pins, there stands by the wayside a small rude monument of uncut stones, a mere heap surmounted by a rough wooden cross. Such stone heaps as this are common on the West Coast, and originate in the custom of making a family memorial, each member of the family, or in some cases each friend attending the funeral, contributing a stone to the rude monument. In some neighborhoods, every relative and friend casts a stone on the common pile whenever he passes the spot, so the heap is constantly growing. This particular monument in Connemara does not differ in any important respect from many others, but before it, in the summer of 1886, there knelt all day long an old peasant woman. Every morning she came from a hut in the glen nearby, and spent every hour of daylight in prayer before the wooden cross. It seemed to matter little to her whether it rained or the sun shone, In sunshine, the hood of her tattered cloak was thrown back and her white hair exposed, while the rain compelled her to draw the hood forward. But rain or shine, she was always there, her lips silently moving as the beads slipped through her withered fingers. Nor could any question divert her attention from her devotions. She never looked up, never took the slightest notice of remarks addressed to her, nor was she ever heard to speak aloud. Once a week's provisions were sent to her house from the nearest police station. They were left within, and those who brought them went their way, for she gave no word of thanks, no look of gratitude. Nor for many years had the constables sent with the allowance made her by the government ventured to compel her to speak to them. Her story was told by a sergeant of police and formed of painful illustration of the poteen trade in the mountains. In the year 1850, while the country was still suffering from the effects of the starving time, she lived with her husband, Michael O'Malley, and her 4 sons on a little farm near Lake Derryclare. Year after year had the crops failed, but the little family held together, faring or rather starving alike. In the year mentioned, although the country in general was beginning to recover from the famine, this part of Connemara was still stricken, and the crops seemed likely again to fail. Starvation stared the hapless family in the face. The boys were well-grown lads, accustomed to the hard life of peasants, and willing to work if any could be found. All 4 left home, the eldest going to Galway, the other 3 to the seashore, where they found temporary employment in the fisheries. While so engaged, they learned the secret up in a retired spot nearby, and the manufacture of the poteen began in as large quantities as their limited resources would allow. A number of years passed, and as their product found a ready sale in the neighborhood, the O'Malleys prospered as they had never done before. The boys married and families grew around them. The eldest brother up in a retired spot nearby, and the manufacture of the poteen began in as large quantities as their limited resources would allow. A number of years passed, and as their product found a ready sale in the neighborhood, the O'Malleys prospered as they had never done before. The boys married and families grew around them. The eldest brother, John O'Malley, having gone to Galway, succeeded by what he considered a great stroke of good fortune in obtaining a place on the constabulary. The family at home knew nothing of him, nor had he communicated with them, for directly after his enlistment he was sent to the county Wexford, on the opposite side of the island, and completely lost sight of his old home. Proving intelligent and capable, he was promoted, made a sergeant, and ordered to the county Galway. Immediately upon his arrival at his new post, a small village in Connemara, intelligence was brought of illicit distilling near the 12 Pins, and O'Malley was ordered to proceed with a strong party of police to seize the still, and if possible arrest the criminals. The names of the offenders were not given, but the location of the glen where operations were carried on was described with such exactness that O'Malley, who knew every foot of ground in the vicinity, laid such plans as to render escape by the distillers a practical impossibility. Before dark, one evening, a party of 12 mounted constables, armed with rifles, started from Maum at the head of Lough Corrib, and travelled all night, and by morning Sergeant O'Malley had so posted his men round the glen that the arrest of the distillers was apparently a certainty. In the early dawn, before objects could be distinctly seen, several men were observed going into was still in operation. A desperate fight ensued, and Sergeant O'Malley was shot dead by one of the brothers, without knowing whose hand pointed the weapon. Before dark one evening, a party of 12 mounted constables, armed with rifles, started from Maumee at the head of Lough Corrib, travelled all night, and by morning Sergeant O'Malley had so posted his men round the glen that the arrest of the distillers was apparently a certainty. In the early dawn, before the objects could be distinctly seen, several men were observed going into the glen, and at a given signal the police closed in on the little shanty where the still was still in operation. A desperate battle ensued, and Sergeant O'Malley was shot dead by one of his brothers, without knowing whose hand pointed the weapon. 2 of the O'Malleys were killed by the police bullets, and a constable was mortally wounded. Michael and his remaining son were taken alive afterwards and tried for murder, when for the first time they learned that the dead sergeant was their relative. Michael and his remaining son were taken alive afterwards, tried for murder, when for the first time they learned that the dead sergeant was their relative. Both were hanged, the singular circumstances of the crime for which they suffered attracting wide attention. Mrs. O'Malley thus beheld herself at a single blow deprived of her husband and her 4 sons. For a time she was widely demented, but the violence passed away, and as her clouded brain became calmer, it was occupied by one idea, to the exclusion of all others: a prayer. Prayer for the repose of the dead, the body of which the sergeant was buried near Maumee. But O'Malley and his 3 sons were buried together under the cairn in a long disused churchyard through which the road passed. A churchyard like thousands more in Ireland, where the gravestones are hidden by the nettles and the weeds. Thither, with a love stronger than death, goes the poor old woman every day, untiring in her devotion. She spends her life reciting the prayers for the dead.